preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
First, thank you to Laura for organizing this event, and of course to the Y for having me here. The last time I was here was to the wonderful German writer W.G. Sebald. I was fortunate to him just before he died in England. It's an extremely memorable visit for me. Mostly I'm going to talk about the Underground Railroad nationally and in New York City. But I want to read you just a very short section. It's the beginning of the book, actually, and about an incident that occurred far from New York. But it's a vivid image of the Underground Railroad in action. And it's pretty much self-explanatory. The year is 1844 or 1845. Imagine the scene. The night air is acrid, as it always is in Madison, Indiana, with the smell of the slaughterhouses and tanneries that line the north shore of the Ohio River. It is almost 10 o'clock, and in this era before electricity and street lamps, the darkness is profound. The barber has done what he was told. He is alone on the street corner. He waits with the nearly killing anxiety of a man who is about to commit a crime. He is a slave, and he is about to steal himself. The barber had been working in Madison and sending his earnings back to his master in Kentucky, a common enough arrangement in the border states. He could walk away from the corner, he knew. He could go home, abandon hope of escape, get along somehow as a slave and stay safe in a way. But he could not forget George de Baptist's words to him. Aren't you ashamed, you, a man able to make money and take care of yourself, with a good trade, young, strong, and a man all over, if you're only a mind to be calling another man your master like a dog, paying over to him your wages? At 10 o'clock, steps approach, and a black man slips from the shadows. He tells the barber to walk to the roadbed where the new railway is to be laid north from Madison. When he gets to it, he is to walk north until he reaches the post that marks the 2nd mile, and then whistle twice. The barber follows the instructions. He is leaving an entire life behind and walking into the unknown. He is attuned to every rustle, click, and murmur of life in the night, straining for the sounds of feet in pursuit. It is a hard place for blacks, the southern edge of Indiana. White vigilantes sometimes attack blacks in their homes in Madison. Slave catchers prowl the backcountry hunting runaways. The barber knows, as every fugitive knows, that at any moment his break for freedom may turn into a disaster. At the 2-mile marker, the barber screws up his courage and whistles. Another black man slips from the woods with a gun at the ready. Walk another 2 miles, he tells the barber, and falls into step behind him. At the next appointed spot, a second armed man appears and orders him to walk 2 more miles, with the 2 gunmen now following behind him. The drill is repeated 4 times until the barber is surrounded by 8 armed men. 16 miles beyond Madison, instead of another gunman, there's a wagon waiting. Into it the barber climbs, and for the first time during that long night, perhaps, he begins to breathe normally again. Ahead of him lie the welcoming farms of white Presbyterian and Quaker farmers, of free blacks who do not fear the writs and guns of slave hunters and his own freedom. George de Baptist, the man who prompted the barber's elaborate escape, who executed it, who ensured that even if the fugitives' party was discovered, it was carrying enough firepower to defend itself, was also, as it happened, a barber. He was also the secret head of the local Underground Railroad. In some respects, de Baptist was a very ordinary man, about 30 years old at the time, well known to everyone in Madison as a respectable member of the town's small, free black middle class. Unknown to them, almost every day of his life, he tested the limits to which a black man would be allowed to go in the deeply racist America of the 1840s. It was dangerous enough for radical white abolitionists to risk helping fugitive strangers, breaking federal law every time they did it. For a black man who could never count on the law to be on his side, it was brave beyond imagining. For the Underground, both opportunity and death were as close as the Kentucky shore. Madison stood on the invisible line that ran along the Ohio River, dividing the slave states from the free as absolutely as if they had been cut apart by a cleaver. During his 8 years in Madison, DeBaptist estimated that he personally assisted 108 fugitives to freedom, and several times that number indirectly. Failure at any point could easily have cost him his life. The name of the barber who escaped that night more than a century and a half ago has long been forgotten. His story still exists only because it survived in the memory of George DeBaptist, who recounted it to a reporter for a Detroit newspaper in 1870, a few years before he died. But the events of that night were epical in their way. Another chip had silently been knocked out of the edifice of slavery, and another victory gained for the clandestine army that was changing America. Incidentally, the dialogue there is not invented. It's not fictional dialogue. This is the story basically as it was recounted by George DeBaptist himself. It's the way he remembered the event. This is a work of history. It's not a work of the imagination. Everything's documented and exhaustively, not to say tediously, footnoted. But descriptions of the Underground Railroad in action like that are comparatively rare, and I wanted you to hear one of them. Most of us, I think it's fair to say, probably grew up with, if we grew up with the notion of the Underground Railroad at all, it's of a kind of vague, maybe composite picture of midnight rides and hair's breadth escapes, like as not involving Harriet Tubman in some fashion, and that's more or less where it ends for most people. And why basically that's all we know, or all we were raised with as an image of the Underground Railroad, I'm going to talk about later, because it was far, far more substantive. It was a movement with tremendous impact in the United States, and much of the truth of it was aggressively forgotten and pushed out of the historical record. See if this is, yeah. Oh, just to go back, just so you know what that was, because it's probably not going to come back. This is the earliest representation of the Underground Railroad in this iconographic image of a little train going into a tunnel, and dates from 1844. It's from an abolitionist newspaper in Illinois. And the text here is entirely ironic. It's published for abolitionists, and I'll just read a couple of lines so you get the sense of it. It says, "The Liberty Line, new arrangement day and night, the improved and splendid locomotives, Clarkson and Lundy," those are two famous British abolitionists, "with their trains fitted up in the best style of accommodation for passengers, will run their regular trips during the present season between the borders of the patriarchal Dominion, the South, and Libertyville, Upper Canada. Gentlemen and ladies who may wish to improve their health or circumstances by a northern tour are respectfully invited to give us their patronage." Anyway. Or speak into it. Okay. I'm sorry. Although do feel free to come closer up if you want to. All right. This image, again, pretty much speaks for itself. It's from an abolitionist publication. But this is a scene that was commonplace on southern roads in the United States, and frankly, until the abolition of slavery in New York in 1827. You could see scenes something like this in New York State as well. It's a line of men, a coffle, which means enslaved people chained together, marching with two fiddlers at the head to presumably encourage them to keep up their pace. Someone with a whip on horseback and an American flag. Slavery was as American as the flag. That's the point that the abolitionists were making, and it's also true. Anyway, apart from sporadic slave rebellions and individual acts of defiance, only the Underground Railroad physically resisted slavery. It was the country's first interracial political movement. It changed relations between the races in ways that were much more radical than anything that would be seen again until the second half of the 20th century. It was also the nation's first great movement of mass civil disobedience since the American Revolution, and it was the first American mass movement that asserted the principle of personal, active responsibility for others' human rights. And along with the broader abolition movement, the Underground Railroad was also the seedbed of American feminism, which is a connection that's typically not made. However, all the women who organized the first National Women's Rights Conference at Seneca Falls, New York in 1848 had their roots in the abolitionist underground. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, whom everybody knows, was the first national leader of the women's movement, put it this way: woman is more fully identified with the slave than man can possibly be. Incidentally, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was radicalized as a result of visiting her uncle, Gerrit Smith, a radical abolitionist who lived not too far from Syracuse, New York, very, very wealthy man who helped finance much of the abolitionist movement, but also was a station master on the Underground Railroad. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton would sit in the Smith's parlor and listen to fugitive slaves who'd come north talk about slavery. And that was what transformed her, really, from along with her recognition of her situation as a wife in a remote town in rural New York, but that was what politicized her. In the underground, women were for the first time participants in a political movement on an equal plane with men, sheltering and clothing fugitive slaves, serving as guides, and risking reprisals against their families, and for the first time, publicly insisting that their voices be heard. When did the Underground Railroad begin? Insofar as most of us have heard anything about that, we usually think it was in the late 1830s after the establishment of national anti-slavery societies. It was Philadelphia, the late 1790s, first years of the 1800s. Why then and why there? Because until that decade, virtually every state, with the exception of Vermont and Massachusetts, were slave states. As I said before, New York did not free the last enslaved people until 1827. There were enslaved people in New Jersey until 1864. And indeed, as late as 1876, there were more slaves in New York State than there were in Georgia. So the Underground Railroad couldn't exist until there were safe havens into which people could safely be delivered. And the first safe haven was Philadelphia. Why? Because it had the human synergy that was essential for the Underground Railroad to work. A fairly large population of anti-slavery Quakers, anti-slavery whites, predominantly Quakers, and a very large population of free blacks. Philadelphia was the first place where there was a large and increasingly cosmopolitan and politically active population of free blacks. The Underground Railroad was an racially integrated movement from its beginning. It couldn't have existed or worked were it only African American or only white. This rather stolid-looking fellow up here is a man named Isaac Tatum Hopper, whose name we ought to know as well as we do William Lloyd Garrison or Frederick Douglass. He was basically the father of the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia in the 1790s. He began doing the work that we know as Underground Railroad work in that decade, moving people from place to place, from safe house to safe house, and then out of the city to farms where they would be protected and be able to work. Many of the fugitives in those early days aren't coming from somewhere in the South. They're fleeing from New Jersey to Pennsylvania or from New York to Pennsylvania. Isaac Hopper, later in the 1820s, moved here to New York City, and along with let's see him, I guess. Sorry. There we go. And along with this gentleman, David Ruggles, another individual whose name we all ought to know, built the Underground Railroad here in New York City in the 1830s. I'll come back to Ruggles and Hopper in a few minutes. Very few fugitives were captured once they reached the safe embrace of the Underground Railroad. How many? The exact number is unknowable because nobody was clocking fugitives in as they came across the Pennsylvania state line or into Ontario. But my best guess is approximately 100,000 people between about 1800 and 1860, with the number per year tending to increase after the 1830s. The number might be slightly higher, but I doubt it. This is I prefer to err on the side of on the conservative side than to make outlandish claims for the Underground Railroad, as often was sometimes in the past. To put that number of 100,000 in perspective, that's a lot of lives saved, a lot of lives that were able to be lived out in freedom. However, there were 4 million enslaved people in the United States in the year 1860, 100,000 over 60 years compared to 4 million enslaved people. So that 100,000 is a modest number, but a bit later I'll talk about some of the implications of that. Basically, that's 100,000 people who were delivered into northern communities. Most people didn't go to Canada. A fairly small percentage, maybe about 20% actually went to Canada. Many went to Canada, came back because wages were higher in the United States, and people made the kind of pragmatic choice that human beings often make, which is to sacrifice some freedom for more money. There's a lot of variety in how people used the Underground Railroad, where they went and what they did. There's not only one template. I think by the 1850s, there might have been a total of something like 10 to 15,000 hardcore underground activists, and then a much larger number of abolitionists who were, for one reason or another, not willing to break the law, but were quite willing to protect those who did. The Underground's greatest expansion after the 1830s was exactly contemporaneous with the spread of iron railroads around the United States, the northern states anyway. Railroads were the next big thing of the day, and the language of iron railroading lent itself just perfectly to what the Underground was already doing. That's to say, speaking of safe houses as stations, the people who lived there as station masters, guides as conductors, farm wagons in which fugitives might be carried. I've got a farm wagon, let's see. No, sorry. Yeah, a farm wagon. This is a wagon that was actually used in underground work. It exists. It's in Indiana at the moment, but since I had this image, I thought it'd be interesting for you to see. Anyway, referring to wagons in which people were carried as trains and the teams that pulled them as engines and so on. It was a perfect fit. The language caught on. Everybody used it. The Underground was a model of democracy in action. It operated with a maximum of grassroots involvement. There was never any president of the Underground Railroad. There was never any board of directors. The way one underground agent in Ohio put it, there was no regular organization, no constitution, no officers, no laws or agreement or rule except the golden rule, and every man did what seemed right in his own eyes. It was diverse, flexible, interlocking, and extremely efficient, a system with no central control, but it worked very efficiently. It reached from the upper edge of the slave states across most of the nominally free states of the North and into Canada. Now, some of you may have seen along the way somewhere a map. The National Park Service uses one like this. It shows the eastern United States, and it shows arrows coming out of Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia and Louisiana, and these big arrows pointing northward and going here and there, and it's all wrong. And it's based basically on legendary assumptions about the Underground. The Underground Railroad barely existed below the line of free states. The one big exception was a Quaker enclave in North Carolina, which I've written about, but quite remarkably sent people all the way to Indiana from North Carolina until they were shut down in the 1850s. But by and large, the Underground Railroad didn't reach much more than 50 to 100 miles maximum into the slave states. It pretty much began at the free state line. The central dramatic event in Underground Railroad work is the escape of the fugitive. Most fugitives were recaptured by far. Most never ever made it to the Underground Railroad. And most people fled not knowing whether they would reach safety or not. And some had contact with Underground Railroad operatives before they crossed, often through networks of enslaved and free people in the slave states. In fact, I think the absolute bravest people involved in the Underground were African Americans who chose to remain enslaved in slave states in order to assist other people out. I've written about one man named Hamilton's Saul. That's a slave name. He belonged to Major Hamilton. And he's not known, his last name isn't known, who remained enslaved by choice in North Carolina for 15 years. He was the go-to person, so to speak, for people who wanted to escape. And he was undercover because he was himself enslaved. When he was about to be exposed, happily, he went out himself and lived out his life in Ohio. Anyway, move along. Where did New York City fit into the pattern? Well, first, I have to say that antebellum New York was a very different city from the one we know today. New York formed the hinge of the so-called Cotton Triangle. That's to say, its economy was wedded to the South. Hundreds of trading ships brought Southern cotton directly to New York, where the city's wharves and warehouses facilitated transshipment to European mills, in the process enriching local middlemen and ship owners and insurers and warehousemen. And Southern planters depended on New York banks to convert cotton profits into cash. As much as 40 cents of every dollar paid for Southern cotton may have wound up in the bank accounts of New York merchants. That's to say, to put it in different terms, the New York City of the antebellum period was not the politically progressive city that we like to think of it as being today. It was tied to the South politically. There was a very strong pro-slavery constituency, and this was a paradise for slave hunters. Sad to say, it's a shameful history, and not surprisingly, New York historians have tended to sweep this under the rug. African Americans were almost completely excluded from New York public schools. They were segregated in theaters, eating places, and accommodations. They were even compelled to cling to the outside of the horse-drawn omnibuses that traveled the city's avenues. That's the forerunners of the motor buses that we have today. They were barred from going indoors on the steamboats that plied the city's waters. And even menial professions were hard for them to break into. When a man named William Hewlett tried to get a cartman's license, a pushcart license, the mayor turned him down despite his having provided 40 character references, quote, on the grounds of public opinion. So this is the New York that David Ruggles is operating in. Slave hunters openly advertised their services in New York newspapers. One Virginian, a man named F.H. Pettus, who practiced law in New York, placed an ad in the papers. The title is in bold capital letters, "Important to the South." This is New York papers, announcing to, quote, to his friends and the public in general that he has been engaged as counsel and advisor in general for a party whose business it is in the northern cities to arrest and secure runaway slaves. He has thus been engaged for several years, and as the act of Congress alone governs now in the city, in business of this sort, which renders it easy for the recovery of such property, he invites post-paid communications to him, enclosing a fee of $20 in each case, and a power of attorney minutely descriptive of the party absconded. Fugitives were at the mercy of a ring that was known to abolitionists as the New York Kidnapping Club. That's a term of that period. It's not my term. And it included professional slave hunters, city constables, local lawyers, and allegedly the city recorder, who was a power in the Democratic Party and a former slave owner himself, who had declared that emancipation was a curse rather than a blessing. Basically, it was usually necessary only for someone claiming to be a slave's owner to appear before a magistrate in New York and to submit an affidavit in order to be permitted to take the slave or alleged slave back to his home state. And it was not uncommon to see recaptured slaves being marched down Broadway in chains to a steamer. I should say also that many of the people who were recaptured in New York City were basically abducted. Well, they were all abducted, but many were not, in fact, former slaves. They were free blacks who were being kidnapped from the streets of the city because there was a profit in it. Slave hunting was a business. Here are some examples. 7-year-old Henry Scott, for instance, was physically snatched from his classroom by a city policeman and a Virginia planter who claimed him as his slave. Peter Martin, a fugitive who had lived in New York for 4 years, was assaulted by police and, when he tried to defend himself, clubbed to the ground and savagely beaten by a mob who came to the aid of the police. Francis Smith, a waiter, was preparing to leave for New Haven to be married when he was caught by slave hunters. Smith's fiancée tried to purchase his freedom without success. After months in jail, he was sent back to slavery in Virginia. There's just a lot of stories like this. Anyway, into this maelstrom in 1829 came David Ruggles, who was born free in Connecticut. He was very well educated. He had taught school at one of the first integrated schools in New York in Poughkeepsie. Came down here to the city, began with a small grocery, apparently did passably well, began to write. He was very articulate. He published a magazine, and there were copies of it in the New York Historical Society, which you can read, called The Mirror of Liberty. It's pretty good. And a short section I'm going to read to you in a minute is from that. Ruggles' work with fugitive slaves grew out of a broader agenda of racial self-improvement, which characterized black abolitionists of the period. Convinced that moral virtue could be acquired by reading and reflection, Ruggles opened a bookshop in his home on Lispenard Street. Later, he also opened a reading room for young blacks who were excluded from the city's literary institutions. In 1835, a mostly African-American group that called itself the Friends of Human Rights met, quote, to ascertain, if possible, to the extent to which the cruel practice of kidnapping men, women, and children is carried on in the city. In short, the result was the formation of the Vigilance Committee of New York, the first organized effort on the part of African Americans here to counter this rampant racial violence. Members financed the committee almost entirely with collections taken up among blacks. The Underground Railroad, locally in many areas, I want to underscore, was organized, led, and financed by African Americans. By and large, it was integrated, but it was often organized and financed by African Americans, as it was here in New York at that time. Ruggles was appointed the committee's executive officer, and he declared, and he's talking about underground work here, he said, this was practical abolition. Without the Underground Railroad, which was the cutting edge of abolitionism, the abolitionist movement for emancipation would have been a vast talking shop in which, by and large, I think white abolitionists could agree amongst themselves that slavery was indeed a very nasty thing, and we'd all be happier if it went away. The Underground Railroad ensured that there were many confrontations. I want to read you a very short section about David Ruggles in action. I'm sorry, I forgot to mark it before he came in, so it'll take me a second to get it ready here. Incidentally, when Frederick Douglass escaped from Maryland and arrived eventually in New York City, friendless, alone, and quite frightened on the streets down around Center Street. It was finally to David Ruggles' house that he was led, where a few days later, Ruggles arranged for his wife to come up from Baltimore. It was in Ruggles' house on Lispenard Street that they were married by Reverend Pennington, who himself was a fugitive slave, and it was Ruggles who dispatched Frederick Douglass to New Bedford. Anyway, here, among his admirers, Ruggles had sort of a romantic aura as what they called a General Marion sort of man, renowned for sleepless activity, sagacity, and talent, as one put it, evoking the exploits of a legendary Revolutionary War guerrilla. He boarded incoming ships to see whether slaves were being smuggled in, and boldly pushed his way into homes and fashionable neighborhoods to investigate the status of black domestics whom he suspected might be held in involuntary servitude. Now, in the section I'm going to read, you'll hear more dialogue. This is David Ruggles' rendering. I'm not making up the dialogue. In June 1838, Ruggles reported in detail how he had entered the house of D.K. Dodge, a slaveholder from South Carolina, who maintained a home on Henry Street in Brooklyn Heights, where he kept 3 slaves, one of them for 4 years, far longer than the 9 months permitted to out-of-state slave owners by New York law. At least one of the slaves, a maidservant named Charity, had made contact with the Vigilance Committee and asked for help. Once admitted to the Dodge house, Ruggles simply refused to leave. Dodge's wife maintained that they had brought the slaves north specifically to set them free. "Haven't I told you that you are free?" she asked Charity. "You told me to say so if anybody asked me," Charity replied, emboldened by Ruggles' presence. "But you beat me here much as ever, missy." "Why, if Mrs. Dodge brought you here to be free, she would not treat you ill, but on the contrary, she would be kind to you and pay you wages," said Ruggles. "Wages!" exclaimed Charity. "Oh, no," said Dodge, "but I take good care of you." At this point, a neighbor, a Dr. McLennan, a little fellow with a pair of stiff whiskers, suddenly appeared, apparently intending to evict Ruggles, whom he charged with being an intruder. Ruggles retorted that it was the doctor who was the true intruder, with no right to interfere against liberty and the laws of the state. "I am here to remove a disorderly person," McLennan declared. "Find such a person here and I will aid you in his removal," replied Ruggles. "I was invited here to relieve humanity." "I wish you would leave, sir," McLennan repeated. "I wish you would leave, sir," said Ruggles. "You aggravate me," said the doctor. "You don't aggravate me," replied Ruggles. The doctor, looking over and under his spectacles as though getting ready to use his rattan cane, visibly came to the conclusion, Ruggles supposed, that since the abolitionist was some inches taller and heavier, he would not attempt it. After further irritable debate over the consequences of bringing slaves into New York, the doctor at last begged Ruggles to wait until the man of the house returned before attempting to carry off any of the slaves. "They are perfectly free to do as they please," said Ruggles blandly. "If they choose to remain, they can. I employ no force to remove them. If they go with me, I'll protect them." "I is free as a rat and am going," Charity proclaimed. "If I was to stop here, I should find myself dead tomorrow morning. I know you, missy." Ruggles concluded, "As I was then ready to leave, Charity took a bundle of rags, which were an apology for clothes, and with the editor left her kind and affectionate mistress to take care of herself, and is now doing well." That's David Ruggles in action. And I like this guy. He had the abolitionists of the era, black and white. More often the white ones are pretty humorless, frankly. They primarily come out of the evangelical movement, and they're extremely, sort of relentlessly sober folks. And Ruggles has this, given what he personally was undergoing, that he could maintain some sense of irony and humor in the midst of this, I think is quite wonderful. In 1839, Ruggles himself suffered a complete physical and physical and mental breakdown, and he reluctantly relinquished his leadership in the Vigilance Committee. And he wound up running a spa in Massachusetts. That's another story. Very interesting story. In Florence, Massachusetts, it's where outside Northampton, it's where Sojourner Truth hung out, and all the really hot abolitionists hung out at David Ruggles' spa. So, but it's a good story. But you're not going to hear it. So. Anyway, the underground continued to flourish, however, and I wish there were time to talk about many of these other people. I've already told you that Isaac Hopper was Ruggles' collaborator here in the city. Reverend James Pennington, who I mentioned, married Frederick Douglass. The fiery orator Henry Highland Garnett, James McCune Smith, Charles B. Ray, and white activists like the evangelical dry goods merchant Arthur Tappan, who helped finance the underground in New York. Lower Manhattan, today's Tribeca and Chinatown, was webbed with underground safe houses. If you want to try to imagine where the underground was in New York City, that's where it was. It was Tribeca, and extending over approximately to what was called the 5 Points. I would guess most people here would know that that's the intersection at the bottom of Mulberry Street, what's now the western edge of Chinatown, just behind the city courts, and a little further downtown, just below City Hall. And this whole region is filled with residences in the antebellum period. At any rate, Isaac Hopper's home was 110 Eldridge Street on the Lower East Side, his anti-slavery bookstore at 143 Nassau Street, the Reverend Theodore Wright's home on the corner of White Street and West Broadway, the Zion African Methodist Episcopal Church a few blocks away, Dennis Harris's sugar refinery on Duane Street. One contemporary called it a sort of Grand Central Station of the Underground Railroad. The Shiloh Colored Presbyterian Church at the corner of Frankfort and William Streets, the offices of the American Anti-Slavery Society at 138 Nassau Street, and Henry Ward Beecher's famous Plymouth Church in Brooklyn Heights in the 1850s. These are just a few. Some fugitives settled in New York and blended into the existing black community here. In the late 1830s, it was estimated that there might be as many as 5,000 fugitive slaves in the city. I don't think that's true. I think it was much fewer than that. But I quote it because it's an estimate that dates from that era. Others were sent to Long Island, to black communities like Weeksville and present-day Brooklyn. Others up the coast to Connecticut and Massachusetts. But most seem to have been sent north up the Hudson Valley to Albany and Troy, and then forwarded to safe havens in central New York and Canada. Between 1842 and 43, just to pick one year, the Albany Vigilance Committee, also almost entirely African-American, handled about 350 fugitives, virtually all certainly from New York City. That's an average of about one a day. And that is a fairly busy underground route, one a day. Let's see what's next here. Okay, we've seen the wagon. All right. Let's go one more. All right. Yeah, I'm going to zip through a couple here because I don't think there's time to talk about them in detail. Most fugitives on the underground were not hidden in exotic places. Frankly, basically forget about tunnels and weirdly constructed hidey holes. Some unusual hiding places existed. They are very, very, very rare. This happens to be one that does exist, although it's really a crawl space behind a bedroom. It happens to be in Indiana in the home of Levi Coffin, a very prominent abolitionist and Underground Railroad agent. That wagon in the earlier picture belonged to that same property. This little room could be hidden behind the bedstead. Were fugitive slaves ever in there? Yes. Were they generally there? No. Mostly people, and there are many fugitive narratives, memoirs. By and large, people sat in an upstairs room. They went out to the barn. They waited in the kitchen. They sat in the living room, out in the cornfield or a patch of woods. In all the more or less logical places where you would be inclined to ask people to sit who'd arrived suddenly and had to be moved on pretty quickly. Quickly, how dangerous was the Underground Railroad? I'm going to talk more about that. This is known as the Branded Hand. It belonged to a man named Jonathan Walker. He was a Yankee sea captain from Massachusetts who sailed with 7 fugitive slaves from Pensacola, Florida, in an effort to reach the Bahamas. The Underground Railroad was also seagoing from some southern ports. They were caught in it's now Miami. There was no Miami there, but that's where they were captured, taken back in chains, all of them. Walker was branded with an iron, SS for slave stealer. Much later, when he was freed, he became a speaker at abolitionist gatherings in the North. He wasn't much of a speaker, apparently, but he put his hand out. And he would just stand there with the hand, and it was apparently quite a powerful thing. Again, how secret was the Underground Railroad? This is an image of one of the most famous escapes, a man named Henry Box Brown. He took the name Box because he escaped in a box. He had himself boxed up in Richmond, Virginia, which is about as far south as you find any underground activity. A white storekeeper boxed him up and arranged for him to be shipped to the abolitionist office in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And these 4 gentlemen up there are well-known members of the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society. And it's an incredible story. His narrative was published. It's available. It's in print. I also recount it in brief in the book. He was in that box for about a day, hair-raising story. When the box was opened up, he obviously didn't know whether he was going to live or die. He got up. He sang a psalm, and he passed out and fell out of the box. But he made a good living happily for himself, touring around telling the story of his escape. Okay, Port of Albany. This is where people are going from New York City. Port of Albany in the 1840s. There was a land route which fugitives traveled that ran. Now, Quakers were a very, very significant minority in New York City in the late 18th and early 19th century. There are very few Quakers today. There are only 87,000 in the entire United States. And in New York, they're almost completely submerged as a part of the population. But they were very significant in the early 19th century. There was a band of Quaker communities that ran continuously from Manhattan all the way up to northern Vermont. And those communities essentially represented an underground railroad line. It took about 10 days or 2 weeks for somebody to get up there on foot. Perhaps, not surprisingly, when steamboats became available, the Underground Railroad, which like all Americans, people of the Underground Railroad, like all Americans, always adopted new technology when it existed. It took only about 7 hours to get by steamboat from New York City to Albany, and there were 500 commercial boats a day on the Hudson in this period, many of them captained, crewed, and owned by African Americans. Fugitives were, generally speaking, there was some variation, but put on a boat. In this, I'm not going to read this section because I think I want to move on a little faster. At any rate, Reverend Charles Ray, who succeeded David Ruggles as a key leader of the underground in New York City, and was that for many years, once had a party of 28 people on his hands, and he described, it's a very rare description to find this, by the way, I secured passage for them in a barge, and Mr. Wright and myself spent the day in providing food and personally saw them on the barge. I then took the regular passenger boat at the foot of Cortlandt Street and started for Albany. He's on a faster boat. He's there in Albany to meet the barge when it arrives and lead people to friendly homes in Albany and Troy. And just as steamboats replaced the old land route, I think everybody knows who this is, Harriet Tubman. Just as steamboats replaced the old land route, the underground literally took to the rails when it could. The opening of the railroad up the eastern shore of the Hudson in 1851 cut travel time in half yet again to approximately 4 hours. In 1855, Harriet Tubman simply took one party that she'd brought from Maryland, including a couple of her brothers, to Grand Central Station and bought them tickets to Albany. Now, I mean, people always ask, wasn't it just too dangerous to travel openly like that? Wouldn't everybody just be caught? Well, you know, the image of fugitive slaves sneaking north in the dead of night has this terrific iconic power. And in the border country, as I implied earlier, it was as secret as it could possibly be. Henry Box Brown in the box, the branded hand. There, you're risking social ostracism and your property, your family, and sometimes your life to help fugitives. But further north, the underground was amazingly open. Abolitionist newspapers like The Voice of the Fugitive, published by Henry Bibb, a fugitive himself. He tried 7 times to escape before he succeeded, became educated in Detroit, and was a wonderful natural writer and published a great newspaper. Anyway, his newspaper often reported underground news in detail, including the passage of fugitives through town and even the names of the people who helped them. This is a man named Jermaine Logan. Jermaine Logan is another one of these incredible individuals who was dropped out of our remembering of the Underground Railroad. He ought to be as well known as Frederick Douglass and many others. In brief, Logan was a fugitive slave, escaped from Tennessee in 1834, rode on horseback all the way to Canada, and he came back to New York State to work. Went to the first integrated school of higher education in the U.S., the Oneida Institute near Utica, became a Congregationalist minister, a fiery preacher, and by the mid-1850s, he was the leader of the Underground Railroad in Syracuse, New York, which was regarded as possibly the most abolitionized city in the United States. Logan would advertise his home in newspapers as the main underground station in the city. He had business cards, which you can see in the Historical Society up there, that say, Jermaine Logan, Station Master, Underground Railroad. He handed them out. He defied his former owner to come up from Tennessee and get them. Public fundraisers for the Syracuse Underground were held in the city council chambers. And a local band even composed a popular song called the Underground Railroad Quick Step, and dedicated it to Logan. And in other places, Albany, Detroit, for example, the Underground published posters announcing exactly what it was doing and where it was doing it. This poster's in the book. Let me ask, can you read this, or it's probably too hard to read this, the small lettering. Okay, I want to read part of this to you because it's really great. It says, stockholders of the Underground Railroad Company, hold on to your stock. There's no Underground Railroad Company. This is underground humor. Anyway, hold on to your stock. The market has an upward tendency. By the express train, which arrived this morning at 3 o'clock, $15,000 worth of human merchandise, consisting of 29 able-bodied men and women, fresh and sound from the Carolina and Kentucky plantations, have arrived safe at the depot on the other side. Stockholders, don't forget the meeting at 2 o'clock at the ferry. You want to find the Underground, come to the ferry. We'll be there. Hey, we'll even have some fugitive slaves. You can meet them, say hello. So what's the point here? In short, and when I'm finished, we can discuss this a bit more if you want to pursue it. In the present day, we expect the law to be enforced equally everywhere. It's part of the bedrock of our conception of what a society of law is. And we are outraged when the law is not enforced the same way in one state as in another. I mean, think of the muscle that put behind the federal government during the civil rights movement in the 60s. In the antebellum period, that was absolutely not true. And I only understood this in the course of researching this book, which is to say the law was applied very randomly. Constables, police, judges, magistrates, other officials applied the law pretty much as they saw fit or not. And increasingly, fugitive slave laws simply were not enforced in the North because white Northerners recognized that their own rights, I mean, they may have been fundamentally racist, white Northerners, racist, they may not have given a damn about enslaved people in the South, but they knew that their own rights as citizens were being chiseled away in order to protect slavery by laws that required that everybody participate in recapturing fugitives. And increasingly, Northern administrations just didn't apply the law. There's much more to be said on that, but that's the basic idea. Okay, so for generations, Americans thought of the Underground Railroad as a mostly monochromatic narrative of high-minded white people condescending to assist terrified and helpless blacks. Well, only recently and finally have African Americans been restored to the rightful place at the center of the story. Now, as I said at the beginning, apart from the lives saved, the Underground's greatest achievement may have been its creation of a truly free zone of interracial activity where blacks not only directed complex logistical and financial operations, but also supervised, in many cases, networks that included white men and women who sometimes recorded no special status because of their color. This was very radical. Why don't we know all this? I mean, why don't we already know everything about David Ruggles and Isaac Hopper and George DeBaptist and Henry Bibb and Jermaine Logan and scores of other people, black and white, whom I haven't had time to mention. During the dark night of Jim Crow politics, the truth was actively suppressed, or at least aggressively forgotten. A decade after the Civil War, as we all know, the government, this country, abandoned Reconstruction, and in abandoning Reconstruction, it abandoned its commitment to African Americans. With 360,000 Union dead, won on the battlefield, politicians essentially sold out in the 1870s. So in a nation that became committed to segregation and blind to racism, the story of a politically radical and biracial movement, partly led, organized, and financed by African Americans, was way too subversive to suit the national narrative of reconciliation and of racism that the country wished to tell itself. So the story of the Underground Railroad, I think, has a lot to say to us today. This isn't dry, dull history, irrelevant history. There's a lot to say to us in an era when Americans still have a difficult time talking honestly and bluntly about race and slavery. And in an age when shameless self-interest has been elevated to a public and political virtue, the bravery and selflessness of the men and women of the Underground tells us that every individual, no matter how humble, can make a difference in the world. And that the importance of one's life, I think, lies not in money or celebrity, but in doing the right thing, even in silence or secrecy and without reward. The Underground Railroad forced Americans to think in new ways about slavery. It saved all those tens of thousands of lives. It delivered thousands of former slaves into northern communities where white Yankees, often in spite of themselves, began to empathize with black Americans for the first time as people like themselves with the same human needs and desires and the same vulnerabilities and the same devotion to family and faith. A century and a half ago, the Underground taught Americans that race was not at the margin, but at the center of our national story, and that our great-great-grandparents were capable of bridging the divide of color in a common endeavor. And the moral courage they bequeathed to us, I think, is their real legacy. Thank you. I'd be very happy to, why don't you leave that image up there while we're talking? Thanks. Thanks. I'd be happy to entertain any questions, if there are any. Fight it out. Okay.
So, if the slave wanted to escape living in the
pretty much I don't know that any one of us living today can put himself in the shoes of an enslaved person of a century and a half ago. It's too presumptuous for me to attempt to do it, though I've thought a great deal about this, But nonetheless, try to imagine yourself enslaved, say, in maybe Atlanta or Macon, Georgia. You're 500 miles from the nearest free state border, 500 miles. You've not been permitted to be educated. You have no map. There aren't any maps. There are no road signs. And every town between you and the Ohio River employs a force of people called patrollers. Think armed thugs, forerunners of the types of people who joined the Klan in the post-war period. And their sole job, they're on salary, they're on retainer, to ensure that no slaves go anywhere, and by and large, free African Americans as well. The odds are almost impossible to overcome. Now and again, there's an exception that proves the rule. It's very, very hard. So yes, you're on your own. Most people are recaptured. There's an excellent book, by the way, I recommend, called Runaway Slaves by the great historian John Hope Franklin, and is about the whole phenomenon of slaves running away. He does not discuss the Underground Railroad. He's talking about slaves running away in the South. It's in paperback. Barnes & Noble usually has it. It's a really fine book. Well, imagine, this is a really, really harsh way of putting it, but it's, I'm trying to get you in the mind of people of the time. Suppose slaves were property, artifacts. If your car breaks down on you, do you blow up the car? No. There were instances, of course, because masters are never really punished for crimes committed against slaves. Virtually never, regardless of the fact that there are laws on the books in the South. No blacks can testify in court against a white man. So no matter what he's done to you, you can't go to anybody and complain about it. So, but how much are you going to damage property you want to work for you?
I was actually wondering, in addition to the New York Historical Society, what other sources would you recommend that are real sources?
Okay, there's not much in the New York Historical Society on the Underground Railroad. This the best archive. It's a giant archive, and it's superb. Is the Wilbur Siebert collection, S-I-E-B-E-R-T collection. It's at Ohio State. Well, it's at the Ohio Historical Society. At the Ohio Historical Society in Columbus. It's a great collection. You can get everything in it on interlibrary loan on microfilm. And it's just fascinating. Wilbur Siebert was kind of the great Ohio historian. He was born in about 1859 and he lived to 1951. He had a long life. He remained intellectually active his whole life, and he continued doing Underground Railroad research his whole life, spanning 3 generations of research, actually. But he began doing it in the 1890s when lots of veterans of the Underground were still alive. He interviewed scores, hundreds actually, of them in person or by letter. And all that original material is there in the Siebert Archives in Ohio. As they say, interlibrary loan. And it's supposed to be going online soon. In fact, if you try Googling it, they may have some of it up by now. The photographs in the collection are up. Yes, sir.
The slaves that arrived in Canada, were they treated normally? Did they get jobs?
That's a great question. I'll try to be concise because there's a lot to say about it. Canadians will tend to jump up, when this issue arises, and talk about how racist Canadians really were. But putting that aside, Canada welcomed with open arms African-American fugitives. 2 things at work. On the idealistic side, abolitionism was ascendant in Britain, and the governor of Canada in the turn of the 19th century proclaimed that slavery was that was not going to be recognized in Canada. It was established and then supported by law quite early. On the more pragmatic side, Canada welcomed anybody it thought would shoulder a gun against the United States, and they figured that fugitive slaves were a good bet. And they were proven correct, because former slaves were renowned in Canada as in that period as making the best militia troops. None of them deserted. And I mean, imagine having been enslaved and being able to carry a gun. You know, I mean, the symbolism of it is very powerful. Also, finally, a bunch of model communities were established in southern Ontario. I've written a lot about that in the book, actually. Several model communities, usually by or in collaboration with African Americans, that were termini on the Underground Railroad, plus communities designed to educate people and help assimilate them to essentially a money economy. Very, very interesting stuff. The first black Canadian was elected to office in 1859. He was a man named Isaac Shadd, who was himself an Underground Railroad conductor from West Chester, Pennsylvania, who moved up there. And the black vote was the swing vote in southern Ontario through the 1860s.
In other words, they could vote.
Right away. And they could vote, and their rights were protected. You know, you also, I could tell you a few more sources afterward. There are a couple of, I've got a couple of websites listed here, but rather than rummage in here and try to read them out, but don't let me forget after we're done. Let this gentleman.
Something that was very interesting. He said 100,000 were, yet the slave owners were really scared. I'm wondering they're only, if they even lost 100 to fight for the fugitive slave war. So the Underground Railroad, even though it had Elizabeth Watt, they still could operate. What point was it carried? The fear other slaves would escape? Because there was a lot of debate, and they demanded that the fugitive slave.
Yeah, absolutely. The Underground Railroad, the existence of the Underground Railroad was a significant element in bringing on the Civil War. Ironically, slave owners attributed a much vaster extent and greater power to the Underground than it did actually have. They tended to attribute every single escape to the Underground Railroad. And as John Hope Franklin shows in his book, most people were never even making it out of the South. They were often being arrested and resold somewhere else in the South, or trying to submerge in an existing black population somewhere else in the South. But so the perception of the Underground Railroad was Southerners saw it as an almost military assault. Yeah, very pertinent. Yeah.
Well, I was just before, I was wondering if in your book you mentioned anything, there's a small town upstate called Greenwich.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So
Well, I haven't mentioned it in the book, but I know Greenwich quite well.
oh, okay.
Yeah, actually, there's an Underground Railroad symposium there every summer in July.
Exactly. Okay,
Yeah.
that's what I was wondering if you had mentioned that or aware of that. I know the area too.
Oh, yeah. I live up that way, actually.
We're neighbors.
Well, I live in Dutchess County.
We'll talk.
Okay. Yes.
I just can't help comparing where people seem to me more civilized in that period in helping their fellow man than as a fast forward to the Hitler period. And how many people put out their hands then? The whites were.
Well, I don't have a particularly sunny assessment of human nature in general, frankly. But I think the people involved in the Underground in this country were extraordinary people. It took a tremendous amount of moral courage to do what they were doing. Motivations are somewhat different between African Americans and white Americans. African Americans, the vast majority had either been enslaved or had family who were still enslaved and knew absolutely what the nature of slavery was. And Black Americans are way more willing to be confrontational and physical doing underground work. White Americans were first almost entirely Quaker, and then with a larger and larger number of people coming out of the evangelical revival with strong, what I would call a spiritual imperative. And they often regard what they're doing as a religious duty rather than a political one. It's very interesting. And they often went through a very long, tortured process of weaning themselves away from acceptance of slavery. African Americans didn't have to go through that process because they had it already. But these are extraordinary people, either way, who are able to transcend the mores of their time, fear of ostracism, and they are only a minority. They are only a minority. They themselves are ostracized at the beginning. It's not until really the 1850s that this becomes kind of a really muscular movement. I mean, the analogy is inescapable, but I don't know, I'm not sure what conclusions to draw. Hey.
Compare that to the civil rights movement.
Well,
What you set up the difference between the African American involvement and how the religion and stuff. Do you think that changed now?
well, I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, if we're, okay, the Underground Railroad spans 1800 to 1860. Roughly, although one can date the beginning of the 20th century civil rights movement at all sorts of different dates. And it doesn't necessarily even begin with Martin Luther King, really. There's, of course, the 20th century civil rights, one is heir to the other. The abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad were the country's first civil rights movement. And I will be writing a book in future about what people who were involved in the Underground did after the Civil War during Reconstruction, which is very, very interesting. They didn't all sort of fold their tents and go away. Some did. The underground people, the cutting edge people, did not. A lot of them went south. They were those people who become smeared as carpetbaggers, by Southern propagandists after the Civil War. A lot of them were incredibly courageous people. If you thought it was dangerous doing this work in the North before the Civil War, trying to teach at a black school or be involved in a biracial political movement in the South after the war, as former slave owners become more ascendant. So there is a civil rights movement that continues all the way through. There's an unbroken line, but the rest of the country kind of forgets about it, doesn't want to know about it for reasons that I touched on already. So, I mean, obviously the civil rights movement of the 60s, I did voter registration myself in that time. It becomes much more secular. I mean, there's much more diversity. I mean, obviously, a lot of people with deep religious conviction who are very similar to their predecessors of the antebellum period are there. So are lots and lots of secular people. And you also have, the input of, let's say, radical politics, which drives people in. It's much more diverse. And the country is, I think, readier to hear the message. It's taken the country 100 years to become ready to hear what our great-great-great-grandparents were saying before the Civil War.
I actually work for the historic site related.
Sorry, say again?
I actually work at the historic site related to East Village. And because I lead towards there, I'm an educator, I usually get a lot of kind of, I would say, mythology relating to African Americans as free people versus slaves. Most of the time, African Americans have always been slaves, and that's what I would get from people. But the other kind of myth I always get is related to the Underground Railroad, and a lot of the people in the community
already know the person, Judy Wellman. Judy Wellman, who is the one of the most brilliant people doing research on the Underground Railroad. And Judy Wellman has produced these criteria of evaluation. They're the best. You already know her, but I'll say a word to that anyway. Black church members, black churches were like every other, so to speak, institution. They were very diverse in the antebellum period, and some churches did indeed do underground work. And I think there's no question that some church people out in Weeksville were doing underground work. Other churches wanted no part of it. The law would never protect African Americans, even in the North. Forget about it. And it was way riskier for blacks to break the law in the antebellum period than it was for whites. Most whites who do underground work are middle class and they're pretty established in their communities. And that's not true of African Americans. They can't go to the law to protect them if they're assaulted. So a lot fewer African Americans take that risk than I think many people today would wish. I was in Indianapolis, which had had a very active underground community, including African Americans. And I was in the Second Baptist Church, I'm not sure, in Indianapolis. And the building dates from 1913 or thereabouts. There had been a previous site that dated from around just before the Civil War. And this was an Underground Railroad symposium. And a lady who was a member of the congregation got up, and she was very funny. She said, you know, when I was a little girl, you see those stairs over there? You know, we'd run around and play hide and seek, and we'd say that's where they hid the slaves, in the Underground Railroad under the stairs, and you could be the master. I mean, it was hard to get black kids to play the master, she said. But anyway, they'd sort of play masters and slaves, and the lady said, and she was in her 60s, and she said, I come here on Sunday, and after the service, I'm sitting here, and I see these little kids running around. They say that's where they hid the slaves, under the stairs. We made it up, and the church was built in 1913. So there's an abundance of stories like this. Some rooted in churches, and others up my way in Red Hook, New York, where I live. People heard I was writing this book, and I'd get calls saying, "You're going to write about the tunnels in Red Hook." There aren't any tunnels in Red Hook. Not one. There's not one tunnel in Red Hook. And the Mid-Hudson Valley was said to say one of the most pro-slavery areas in the North. I mean, no fugitive slaves came through this town. So these stories are very tenacious. But anyway, talk to Judy. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you've got the person already. Any more? Sure.
Yeah, I taught for 30 years American history. We taught 8th grade. And most of the time it was American. And it's when the kids was in a minority, Crown Heights, not Park, Michigan. And it's always the Underground Railroad and Harriet, like you said, or Harriet Tubman. And you get maybe, I was asking about Sojourner Truth, did some identify just with her? Do you think the books, because what was the role of Sojourner Truth? You get one sentence on her, but why are these textbooks, can they be improved so that you can see, the identification?
Okay, again, I'll try to be concise. The question about Harriet Tubman is very interesting. And by the way, Harriet Tubman was just an amazing individual. Certainly deserves all the attention that she's received. She was very unusual. And what she achieved is quite exceptional, though there were many people doing the same work. Harriet Tubman also had the good fortune, one, having made contact with the most prominent abolitionists on the East Coast, primarily in Boston. They were fascinated with her. They talked to her. She stayed in their homes, and they interviewed her. And she was being talked about and written about in her lifetime when she was still doing underground work. And she benefited from a biography published in 1877, I think, the first one. Anyway, very early biography. Second, she outlived everybody. She lived until 1913. She was the last person. She was still here, and then she was sort of rediscovered by the women's movement at the turn of the 20th century. And so she outlasted everybody in an era when the country was really suppressing memory of others. What was the other part of your question? Oh, yeah. Well, Sojourner Truth, there's no evidence that Sojourner Truth did any underground work. She was an evangelical minister, trekked around the country, inspired people, but she was primarily a preacher. If she did underground work, I don't know about it, though she did settle in for time in Florence at near David Ruggles' spa. And there was certainly underground work going on there because it was a terminus, Florence. Whether she helped out there or not, I don't know. Yes, sir.
I'm selling your books.
Oh, hey, good man.
I had two questions actually, but I was going to start with another one, but I want to jump off what you were talking about just now, sir. Herbert Cole recently wrote a book that I did another event for on Rosa Parks and how the title of that is "She Could Not Be Moved," and basically it's a debunking of the myth of the civil rights movement and how it went down. And my question to you would be, how do you think that the way that the stories of not of the Underground Railroad, of the civil rights movements, plural, in this country, the way they've been mythicized, the way they've been mythologized, how has that affected how the country has learned to view these issues, and where can we go from there?
Yeah, okay. Okay, parenthetically, before I answer it, there is an excellent new biography of Harriet Tubman called Bound for the Promised Land by Kate Clifford Larson. It is outstandingly good, packed with new research, and she's looked at all kinds of things people never looked at before, so I recommend it to anybody who's looking for a good book on Harriet Tubman. Really serious, well-written book. The mythology. Well, I think I've addressed that with respect to the Underground Railroad. That's to say, we have these iconographic images of the fugitive breaking through running through a cane brake, or we may never even have seen pictures, but we have them in our heads. Bloodhounds at his heels. And I think because the Underground Railroad, this very radical biracial movement, had to be written out of memory because it was seriously too subversive for the way the country shaped itself after the Civil War, we were left with these sterilized images. And I'd go further to say that the kind of preoccupation with bricks and mortar, tunnels and hidey holes. I personally, I think it's neat to be in a house that was a real site. I like historic sites. But there were almost no tunnels. There were almost no exotic hiding places. But it's sterile. It's sterile. There are no people. There's just the iconographic fugitive and then bricks and mortar. And it takes you away from the moral radicalism. The moral dimension and the religious radicals. These were really religious evangelical people, very much like today's hardcore evangelical movement, fundamentalist movement, by the way, except that they came down on the leftward end of the political spectrum as opposed to coming down today on the right, which does tell you, by the way, that movement has a potential to go in either direction, so there's hope. But and I mean that seriously, by the way. First evangelical president we elected was Jimmy Carter, and he was a liberal Democrat. The civil rights movement in general. I think the mythologizing of the 20th century civil rights movement has really served a profoundly good purpose. I'm an historian. I'm an analyst. I pick things apart. I don't like pretty pictures. I like confused pictures that I have to sort of figure out what's really going on here, and that's kind of what I did with the Underground Railroad, try to bore into it and look for what's unexpected and kind of doesn't fit the picture, and then say, where does that go and where's it coming from? And so therefore, as an historian, we need to do that with everything in this country. This country thrives on myths, and we can see from some of the things that are happening in terms of our foreign policy today. We're trapped in some very destructive myths about what kind of country we are. But that's a little outside the scope of what we're talking about. On the other hand, the mythologizing of the 20th century civil rights movement, I think, has had a profound and kind of catalyzing effect on lots of white Americans who needed, who became able to see race in a way that made them feel good. And the great civil rights legislation that was passed back in the 60s was passed with a national consensus. So I think myth can serve very useful purposes, except, they kind of become, they take on a myth takes on a life of its own. I'd love to talk about that for an hour, but I that's not fair to anybody else. Yeah.
I think one of the most interesting things you said is that the way that and maybe this has to do with this gentleman's question, the fact that the Underground Railroad didn't have a hierarchical structure and patriarchal, didn't fit certain other national mythologies, such as a hierarchical structure, and so, in other words, that could be a reason why it could be eliminated from history or misunderstood. In other words, you can't read it because it doesn't fit with your preconceptions. Therefore, you don't understand it, or therefore you wish to get rid of it because it's threatening. You see what I mean? Because that's a very interesting thing about it. And if your culture is based on paternalistic, hierarchical, patriarchal structures, and there's something like this, which is not only interracial but also not any of those things, then it's both threatening and also mysterious. So maybe that's one part of the explanation.
I think that's a great insight. I think that's very good, and I think that's certainly part of the reason. I think that's really very, very good. And
Just addressing that a kid couldn't memorize. Well, the Underground Railroad was founded in by so-and-so.
Well, and also people
You can't categorize it.
Right.
So
And the first question Americans ask is, who's the leader?
that's the Martians.
Yeah, and so like something without a leader, it's like, what? But what's so remarkable about it is a group of people across all kinds of spectrums with the same assumptions and values who were able to operate without the traditional leadership structure. It's very
I did not know that.
yes, and I think perhaps we're better fitted today to remember things that don't fit that kind of structure. But the 19th century was nothing if not hierarchical.
Well, that's one of the
Yeah.
reasons I asked you about the civil rights movement, because it seems like the 1960s civil rights movement wasn't like that. And, it had a lot of political squabbles over leadership, for example. It might have started out like that. Eventually it had a lot of leadership squabbles. I don't know. I don't know as much about it as you do, but I think the way you describe the fact that it sort of self-governing was really the most remarkable thing about it. Fantastic.
Thanks.
Kind of like the internet.
Yes, very much so. I think if it were being invented today, it would take on the language of the internet rather than iron railroads. Actually, yes, precisely.
Decentralized.
Precisely. I often use that as a metaphor for it. Anyone else? Yeah.
This one's easier. No, because I didn't know that it really started at the border states. And I guess my question is, so if you're in Mississippi and you're in Louisiana, why not go deeper? Why not go deeper south? Why only be 50 to 100 miles into enemy territory, so to speak? What happened or didn't happen?
Sometimes people did. Some enslaved people in Louisiana head for, and Texas, head for Mexico. The numbers appear to be pretty small, though. There's a lot of scholarship on that very subject, though, when I speak of the Underground Railroad, it's a very, traditional definition. That's to say, it's an organized, although decentralized, movement that involves black and white abolitionists moving fugitive slaves in a systematic way northward. Okay. Nothing that was systematic in that way, to my knowledge, existed, say, in Texas with respect to Mexico. It didn't exist. In the early period, that's to say the 1700s and the real early 1800s, a lot enslaved people in Georgia fled into Florida, where often they settled mingled with Indians. By the way, it's a myth that Native Americans were always the allies of former slaves. Often they enslaved. Like they had slaves, they bought slaves, they captured people, sold them back to their masters, or sometimes killed them, and sometimes made people part of the community. All of the above, different places, different times. But that's partly why we want to acquire and finally invade Florida, is to shut off that valve. I say we, I mean the United States government, is to shut that valve off. But again, that's not. These are enslaved people heading out on their own, settling in often kind of unpopulated areas or underpopulated areas in Florida in fairly large numbers, armed by the Spanish, fighting back, and are finally suppressed. I wouldn't describe it as, it's not part of the same Underground Railroad. You're in Mississippi, you're in Alabama. Some people run to the ports and hope to get on a boat. Occasionally somebody makes it. There are a few stories of people who make it out of New Orleans all the way to Boston or to England even. Somebody now and again even makes it out of Charleston or out of Savannah. I mean, these are the exceptions that prove the rule. I mean, there's one guy who climbed on top of a train in Huntsville, Alabama, and rode rode the freight cars all the way to Ohio in the 1840s. But he's the only one on record ever to have done it. Again, there were the Crafts, whom I write about in the book, who were enslaved in Macon, Georgia. Incredible story, really an incredible story. They were a married couple. He was very dark-skinned. She was very light-skinned. Yes. She was disguised as a young master, and her head was bandaged so she wouldn't have to speak, and her arm was in a sling so nobody would ask her to write anything because she was not literate. And he was disguised as her body servant. And they took trains to Savannah, and they took steamboats, and they went through Charleston, and they made it all the way up to Philadelphia. And Philadelphia is where they found the Underground. I mean, but these are one-of-a-kind stories, really. They're not the archetypes. Maybe we're done. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.